In this tutorial, we're going to talk about the asset browser, but specifically, we're going to talk about some things that I consider shortcomings in how the asset browser works. So in order to understand how the asset browser works from a workflow standpoint, we need to understand that an asset can be one, a part of an existing file, meaning internally referenced. And the second is it can be referenced externally from an asset library. So if your goal is to move items from the asset browser into a scene and then be done with that, then it works pretty well. But the problem is that sometimes you need something more sophisticated in terms of workflow. You need a kind of bidirectional workflow that allows for an imported referenced item to be edited and then have that return back to the scene. And this is where the asset browser kind of falls short in my opinion. The other problem is that the asset browser doesn't allow you to edit a material that is stored within it in a way that then allows for that change to propagate through the scene. This is another workflow shortcoming in Blender. Let's do a very, very simple demonstration of what the asset browser does. There are a lot of videos on this, and so I'm not going to try and do an extensive tutorial. But what I have is I have 3 cubes, and I have a collection, and then we've got 3 materials applied. So I am partially going to talk about the different modes that you can use the asset browser in terms of importing data into a scene. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to come down to each of these 3 cubes, and I'm going to mark them as an asset. And those appear down here. So right now, we're just going to embed these internally into our document. They're not going to be an externally linked asset. And then I'm going to come to the collection that they belong to, and I'm going to mark that as an asset also. So we're going to take these 3 things from an organizational standpoint. I'm going to put them into the geometry subcategory. And then we're going to come down to the materials section, and I want to turn those into assets. So we'll just mark that as an asset, mark that as an asset, and then mark the green one as an asset also. And these I will organize into the materials category. So we're just going to look at the geometry for right now. So we've got the original components in the scene, and working with collections is a great thing. It gives you the ability to propagate instances of that throughout the scene and use them. But this sort of is an area where we're going to run into problems. So let's look at the fact that if we come back into the main scene here, I can select that collection. We can do an instance to scene, and we can produce that instance. So that's a really well understood feature, and it's really useful if you need to edit what's in that. You come over to the main collection and you make the change inside of it, and it propagates to any instances. So we always have this collection source to come back to. So we can also just come in and add in one of the basic cubes, drop this in, and for some reason it insists on putting it back in this collection. I don't know why that is. So I'm going to drop this back into the main scene collection so it is acting independently. Now when we do this, Blender has 2 ways that it can add that. It can add it as a linked referenced item, or it can do it as an independent data block. So data blocks in Blender are these components of data that can be referenced by other data blocks that are referred to as a user. So if I press the Tab key, A key to select all, and then I press the S key, this change operates just on that block of data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and delete that, and I'm going to drag this back in over here, and I'm going to come here and I'm going to make sure it says linked in this case. Let's drag this back into the main scene. So now if I press the Tab key, press A, and then S, it scales all of these as linked pieces of data. So that's actually really useful. Okay, so let's just sort of consider that to be something that we're going to keep in the back of our mind as we move forward to the next section. But I first want to jump over and talk about materials now. So let's look at materials. We have these 3 materials that are linked to our objects, obviously. And one of my peeves about the way that Blender works, and specifically the way that the asset browser works here, is it gives you the impression that you can select one of the materials and edit it, because this is a common way that other 3D applications work. They'll have a repository for materials, and you can click it and then come over and edit those in some sort of an editor. But that's not how Blender works. And to me, that's a real travesty because you can very easily get into a complex scenario where you can't directly select an object to gain access to a material in order to edit it. That's just something I want to bring up as a workflow problem that I think Blender has. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to come over and work with this as an externally linked asset library. Right now, we've just been doing it in the current file state. So I'm just going to create a new file, and we're going to come up to our preferences, and we want to take note down in file paths that I have currently set up, for the sake of simplicity, a single asset library. And I saved a version of the file that we were just working at inside of this Blender Assets folder, so it will show up as an asset. Now, before we get going too much further, I want to talk about something that's going to trip people up if they don't know what to look for in terms of assigning materials or assets into a category. Right now in our single asset library, we've got these three materials. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come over and I'm going to save another version of this. So we've got 3 cubes, and I'm going to call this 1 cube. So we've got another set of materials here, but I'm actually going to remove these, and I'm going to take this simple material and we're going to remove it, and I'm going to create new, and we'll call this one purple, so that we have a purple material to easily distinguish it from the other materials. Okay, so we need to come over and turn this into an asset. So we need to mark that as an asset, but we need to look at this up here in all because it hasn't been assigned yet to these subcategories. It will only fit in all. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close this, and we're just going to open up a new general file, remove everything. Let's quickly assign our assets browser. And let's come over here and take a look at this when we actually look at the Blender assets, because that is where we saved the file. So you can see that we've got a couple of things going on here. We've got some duplicates because there were materials in the duplicate file. We have our single purple, and let's say that you're right here in a file and you want to take this and you want to move this over to materials. If you try and do this, it's going to give you an error, red error message. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to assign that into a category in the source file. So we need to come back over here, open the blend file, and we need to come over here in the source file, and then we can assign it to the materials. And while I'm here, I might as well clear these assets since they're represented in the other file. So then I can come over and save that, and we'll just go ahead and quit. Okay, and there we go. So you see it's updated automatically, and we don't have those duplicates anymore. But now when we come down to materials, we have purple now represented inside of here. So that's the key. You only can assign items into a category in the source file, but these categories, if we come over and create a new category, let's say I create one called miscellaneous, that's in the assets file. Any file that gets put into the assets library will automatically receive this. So we're going to click new, and we're just going to create a new file, delete everything, and let's look at our asset browser over here. And we're in current file, and we want to switch over to Blender Assets, the current directory structure that we have set up. And I'm going to come over and have us work with just geometry for the time period. I'm going to have us switch to top view and turn off perspective. And we have 3 modes that we can work with: link, append, and append reuse data. Both append options copy the source asset data into the current working file and then break the link back to the asset source files, whereas the link option maintains a link to the source asset files. The default is reuse data, and I think it's a good default. Basically what that means is when you put multiple copies of whatever we have into the scene, they're linked together. They're instances of each other. So if I come over here and drag this in, let me turn on color, and I drag another one, they're linked together. They reference each other. Now let's come over into the main collection that it dropped in that I happen to have called lights, and I'll call this assets reused. One of the things that you're going to note is that we don't have now a master in our scene as if we natively had this in a scene with a collection that we then created an instance of. And this is where we're going to run into one of the weirdnesses in terms of how these imported collections work. What I want to do is I want to come down to the blue cube, and I'm going to pull the blue cube right here, and it's also in that reuse, so it's linked. Because in the original file, this cube was a hierarchical subcomponent of the collection. If we make a change to it, it'll change over here. So I'm going to press the tab key, press the S key to scale, and you can see scaling it also changes the links because we used reuse data, which is a link. So that works great. But let's come down and take a look at what happens now when we change modes. If I come down to link, and then we come and we drag a copy here, it's going to look essentially the same. We'll put 2 copies there, but a big difference now is that if I try and draw a copy of this cube in the scene, it won't happen. So link is actually only going to link to collections. It's not going to link to the individual data components like a polygon mesh as an example. So we're going to hold that off to the side for a minute. Now we're going to come over to append. And append is basically the opposite of append reuse data, where everything will come in as an independent data block unlinked to everything else. So if I put 2 of those here, and then I come back to blue cube, and I put that there, if I press the tab key, and then S to scale, it's its own independent data. It no longer tries to link to these. If we come back up to the top and I select this cube, we can see down here in the object properties, right up at the top, it says 2. So this is being used by 2 other components. Whereas if I select this one, there are none. And one of the other workflow weirdnesses that drives me nuts about this is we have, well, let's come back up here and take a look at this. We've got this instance of a collection, but it doesn't give us any data like that. And so that's a frustration of mine. It doesn't say, hey, this is linked to other things. You can come to select and you can say select linked instance collection, and that'll tell you what it's linked to. So that's at least some good feedback. But let's come over now and note what happens if I come back to this area. These 2 were put into the scene via the link option. And that just means they're going to be linked to the original asset source file. And this is really going to start to get to the heart of what I want to explain in terms of workflow weirdness. If I want to edit, say, the blue cube, that's something we can do, but we have to now edit it back in the original source file. So if I come down to the 3 cubes and I right click on that, you see there's an option here called Open Blend File. Oh, well, that's pretty cool. If I open that, what it's going to do is it's actually going to open a duplicate of the Blender application, and it's going to open that, which is easily visible here because it's got a different shading, the different UI. So if I came to the blue cube, tab key, S to scale that down to 50%, hit return, tab to leave, I save that, and then I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to quit out. We jump back, and it hasn't changed. In fact, if I come over here, let's come back into link mode and I drag another copy of the link data, it too has the original sized cube. Well, this is another peeve, is that when you use this link, something doesn't update correctly. In order for that to happen, you have to save the file, and then you have to come over and you have to reopen it all over again in order for those to update. That's a point of confusion, because if it doesn't update, and you're not aware that that happens, if you jump over and make some subtle variable change that you need to in the source and you come back and you don't realize that it hasn't properly updated, that could throw things off. Well, but that's actually very, very useful in terms of workflow, is being able to gain access to and edit an original source linked externally. It's just that the way it goes about doing it is just slightly clunky. Let's talk for a minute about some other ways that we can gain access to this. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 3 and I'm going to press M. I'm going to make a new collection. We'll call these assets linked. And these I'm going to call M, we'll call assets free, meaning they're not linked to each other. So we've got all of these sort of segregated in a logical sense. Let's say that I wanted to come over to this one right here, and we decided that we wanted to edit that. There are two ways that we can go about gaining access to these instances of collections when they're brought in from the asset browser, because we don't actually have a source for that here in the Blender file. And that's a problem when you need to inevitably make some change. So what you have to be aware of is that if you used either of the append options, you can gain access to the source data by coming over to the Object menu, Apply, and then do Make Instances Real. And then you can gain access to a source subcomponent. But in this particular case, it's not linked to anything. So you have to remember that. If we come back up to these and I invoke the same thing, we come Apply, and then we do Make Instances Real. If I come over to the red cube, press the tab, and then scale, you can see that those have that linked relationship. With these, when they're in a linked format, it works a little bit different. Now, you could come over and do an Apply, Make Instances Real, but we have an extra option when items are linked externally. You can also come up to Object, and you can come down to Relations or Library Override. And I'm not sure why they have both of these options, because they basically do the same thing. If you do a Make Library Override, then you can gain access to the subcomponents. Those subcomponents still remain linked, but you have now some independence for editing those objects. But it has this one caveat. You notice it moved it to the center of the scene. Let me undo. The reason for that is once you do that, it loses the instanced container. So let's take a look at that. This instance icon of the collection actually contains object level data for, say, positioning or rotation or whatever. But as soon as you use that override function, that drops away, and all Blender can do is return these data components back to their original position. So let's actually try and work around this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come back down here, and I'm going to do an open blend file operation to gain back access to these components. And I want to reorganize this just a little bit. So here's the benefit of having this as an externally linked file. So I'm going to do Shift A, and we're going to add an empty into the scene. And I'm going to call this position, or for position. And I'm going to take these three meshes and I'm going to drop them inside of there. So now we can come over and save this, quit Blender. But remember, you got to save, and then you have to come over and you have to reopen it in order for that change to propagate. But what we can do now is I'm going to press Shift S, and I'm going to move the cursor to selected. Okay. And then we can come back up to Object, and we can do a library or relations, make library override. It'll return those up there, but when we look at it right here, we now have this for position. So this doesn't have position because it's just a collection, but this does, this empty. So I can press Shift S and I can do selection to cursor, and we can return that to its same position. It's a little bit weird. Instances do have a function when you reference them from another collection internally for being able to mitigate that. But these options don't work when you do it externally linked, I've found. The asset browser can be a very useful way of organizing a lot of complex data, but it does have some weirdness and some fickleness. But what I want to show you next is actually a method that I prefer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new file, and I'm just going to show you what I do. Remove everything. We'll set the asset browser again. We can see the components that we've just been working with. Switch to top, and I'm going to bypass bringing in anything complex from the asset browser. And instead, I'm going to use the link function. We're going to just find where the asset browser folder is, locate the file that has the collection that we want to import. There's the 3 cubes, and we're going to link that. And we're going to bring that in. Okay, so it's kind of just a different way of gaining access to it. But this method gives us better control. What you want to make sure and do is under Preferences, go to your add-ons, and then you're going to want to make sure you have link edit linked libraries enabled. Now I've done a video on this already, but I wanted to show you this sort of in relationship to the asset browser and why I think the asset browser is still an immature implementation. Because if they had implemented this feature with the asset browser, it just would have made all the difference in the world. Because now when you come over, press the N key or bring out these control panels, if I want to make a change, let's say I press the option D to make a duplicate. When I want to come in and make a change, all you got to do is come over here to edit linked library. Now you do have to save it. The file has to be in a saved mode. So we're just going to come over here and we'll call this Blend02. It needs to be saved for the function to work. But now I can come over here and I can just quickly press that, and then I can make my change, S to bring that back. Okay, and I don't even need to save it. It'll auto-save it, and when I hit return, it's properly updated the scene. I didn't need to jump through any rigmarole of a second application or saving and then, reopening the file. It just works. Well, what's incredibly useful about this is that you can have a very complex scene and just gain access to a very complex data structure much more easily than trying to come down to your asset browser. If you've got a very complex asset browser setup and trying to hunt through that, or search for it to find it, to gain access to the Open Blend file function. It's just right here, and it's right here. Let me just show you, I have a very complex scene, a much more complex scene of this sci-fi scene that's got these complex components in the scene. And when I'm editing this, if I want to gain access to these instances of collections, I've got to come back up and find where they are up here in my source. I've got to turn it on because these are in an original position. They're not in a posed position. And got to turn it on, and I've got to find the piece of geometry that has the material on there. Then I've got to turn it off, right? And then hope that I've gotten the right thing to see it. And it's a real workflow pain in the butt. Whereas if this were externally linked here, then all I would need to do is come over to item and click it. Now this isn't linked externally. I don't have it linked. All I would need to do is click the edit link button. I could jump in there, select the item that I want and make that change and jump back. And it's an incredibly useful add-on, and I don't know why they don't have it turned on by default. But I will say, as far as a criticism of Blender, is the fact that we still don't have an easy way of gaining access to materials. I've got a bunch of materials, and one of the reasons why I would necessarily want to gain access to the source collection is because I want to select an object that I can then make a material change to. And this is why I think the asset browser is not yet mature enough, or they need to make some changes